Genesis 22. And then there's 1 week where it's pre-Genesis 22 through 50. It can't bother me, it's just funny. That's why you must get to.
So hard for you.
How did you bring up?
Rob, the adjustable ladder and it's rolling all the way down.
You know what? I don't care that you broke your elbow. I don't care. I don't care.
My brother's head. Broke this wrist. Yeah, that's it.
Alex has a question. Alex has a question.
And then,
Hey, take it off.
No.
Saying it's.
No, I said the New Testament version is Paul's word. I'll think it's.
so I looked in there. I went in there, I saw.
I'm gonna lay down and.
And then I gotta go.
Who's back?
That's the book is him. It's about medium amount. Oh, sure, have those concrete walls. He just sits there and stares at it. And he's full, like, full fronts.
All right, let's get started. I'm gonna sit down. My foot is swelling.
I did miss that, but what's going on?
I broke 2 toes on Sunday. I just ladder on my foot and it broke 2 of the toes. Doesn't terribly hurt, but you can feel it swelling as we speak. All right, so today we're going to do a brief introduction to the book of Exodus. You have read Dempster's Biblical Theology of Exodus. You read Terence Frethheim.
Will you do the screen sharing?
And you read Terence Fretheim's introduction to Exodus in the Dictionary of the Old Testament, Pentateuch. Brett and I have been grading your papers, your critical introductions. Brett has made his way through most of them. I think last time I checked, he's got about 10 left, maybe less now. I will circle back through them. He's been giving good feedback, so I don't need to see. I graded first 3, kind of let him see what I'm looking for. And if I feel like he's too heavy-handed, you can earn credit. You will not earn less credit. You can only earn more credit. So whatever Brett gave you, that is the bare minimum of what you've made. Everything I've seen are all been good grades, so you're better off. Today we'll do this introduction. We'll probably have some interesting questions, dialogues. We will then spend the rest of class. Taylor has decided she no longer wants to be the flex instructor, so Micah is going to take over for her. He'll be in here. She has to meeting. So Micah's going to step in. And so I'm going to wait to discuss Wenham's discussion on the religion of the patriarchs with Micah in here. And so that gives 2 of us who've read fairly extensively in this area opportunities to share with you as we walk through that content. I almost required Albrecht Alt's work. That was the first scholarly summary he gave, but I chose not to. I was not going to give you Frank Moore Cross's because I think you read the summary. That's why I don't need to have you read it. So we'll talk about those. We'll kind of have some dialogue about it. No class Thursday. We have Serve Day. So this is really for flex. If you live in the area, you're welcome to come join us for Serve Day. I want to encourage all of you in class to sign up for Serve Day. It's a fun day. I'm leading a team down to Duncan Plaza as I have the last 2 times. So this will be my 3rd time at Duncan Plaza, doing prayer, sharing the gospel with mainly the unhoused community. So Barbara went 1 year with me and one time. It's a lot of fun. So we'll be doing that again. And so they do some work at Friendship House. I think that's Christ Pregnancy Center. Poitras House. They also do Crossroads NOLA, which I've done. That's the foster care nonprofit. And then storm drain clean out. I've done that before. That's enjoyable in some ways. And then prayer walking is also really fun. So I encourage you to do it. You get free lunch, but there's no classes Thursday after chapel. We will rally back here around 3 o'clock for a debrief like we have. I know most of you've done this, but I just want to encourage you to do it. It's an opportunity for me to get to know students and you get to know the faculty, but also meet new students you don't know, particularly graduates, because we don't really have a whole lot of interaction with graduate students per se. So I encourage you to do that. Let's start with a word of prayer. In one of my earlier classes, I have a student, his name is Jake, and his wife is here with him today. Her name is Erica. We have been praying for her for a couple of weeks. She has some growths that are concerning on her head. And so we have prayed specifically for that. It's been recorded in other classes. She is currently at the follow-up doctor to figure out what's next steps for her. So please pray for her and pray for her husband, Jake, because I think it is pretty serious from what I've gathered. Any other prayer requests? All right. If not, let's pray and get started. Heavenly Father, thank you for just an opportunity to serve our community on Thursday. I pray for your spirit to go before all of us to prepare those hearts of those individuals we will meet. Every time we do this, we have people accept you as their Lord and Savior. And so I pray for that same outcome on Thursday. Lord, I pray for safety for our students and staff and faculty that will be doing it. But I just pray for our city. A lot of brokenness, a lot of hurt. So it's an opportunity for us to give back and love on them, provide them an opportunity to just share their stories, to pray with them, and present the gospel if the opportunity arises. Lord, I pray specifically right now for Erica as she is at the doctor, receiving information about what are next steps for what's going on in her life. I can only imagine how extremely stressful and concerning this is. So I pray that just in this moment right now, that your presence is felt in her life, that you give her the greatest care possible through those doctors there in Metairie. For her husband, Jake, I pray that you give him strength to be the strength for her, to be the encouragement to her in this delicate season of life right now. We pray for today. We're going to have some difficult conversations, but that doesn't mean that we should not take them head on. We should take them head on and try to understand your word better. You're going to pray? Amen. All right. So I don't do this this semester. I've done it in the past. I just don't find any great value in it. You're going to read an introduction to each of the biblical books. It's from the dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch. So you read the Genesis one. This one is on Exodus, and you've read Phrathime. And then I didn't require you to read two specific articles by two different evangelicals who argue about the date of the Exodus, but I did kind of have to cover that for us today. I know Phrathime talks a little bit about it. But as we begin this little short PowerPoint, I want to point out to you the fact that any of us believe that the Exodus happened. We are conservative. Okay. Micah has joined us. Those of you who are watching live or recording, y'all remember Micah. I may lean on Micah a little bit with some follow-up questions just so he can, I'm not just saying things that I'm telling the truth. Micah, I just told them anyone that actually believes the Exodus happened, 15th century, 13th century, 12th century, 11th century, you're a conservative. Because in scholarship, they believe the entire book of Exodus is manufactured and not real, because it's not been historically proven. It is directly tied to the book of Joshua, where the book of Joshua describes the destruction of 40 cities, but we have only been able to find 3 of those cities that even show evidence, archaeologically speaking, of destruction. Jericho has destruction, which it actually has 32 layers of destruction. So Jericho apparently had a routine occurrence of being defeated often. And the destruction of Jericho does not line up with the two theories of dating the Exodus to the 15th or 13th century. Hatzor is in northern Israel today, so it would have been in the northern kingdom, and it has been found to have burned residue, which we read in Joshua. They burned that city, so they know that that one has been proven. Just because there is an absence of evidence does not disprove that the Bible is real. Does everybody understand? But for biblical studies at large, not talking about confessional institutions, biblical studies at large, archaeology is not the days of archaeology proving the Bible is a 1950s to 1980s model. Now it is a separate scientific endeavor, which does not always seek to prove anything about the Bible. So biblical scholars who are skeptical use archaeology the way they see fit to interpret the data. Does everybody understand? That is the field we have to navigate. Now, one of the things I do think that's very helpful is in Nahum Sarna's book, Exploring the Exodus. If you have free extra money in your reservoir, you should own that book. Okay. There may not be a better Old Testament undergrad level textbook on a specific topic better than that. You're not going to agree with everything. I don't agree with everything, but it is amazing. He's Jewish. Yeah, he died within the last decade or so. But he makes the argument that the fact that the Exodus coming out of Egypt is repeated over and over again in the first 5 books, first Exodus through Deuteronomy, but then referred to in the Psalms and other texts, it has to be true, whatever that looks like. Why would ancient Israelites record something that never happened? And I think that's a valid argument because it's so paramount to who they are and their identity. So that's kind of where we're going to go. But today we're going to have what you're going to think, man, this sounds liberal. This is actually conservative arguments I'm presenting today. Like these 2 articles that I'm summarizing and presenting are in the Journal for the Evangelical Theological Society. Like it's their arguments. And so just understand, it may sound foreign to us, but it's not going to be radical. And for those who missed it earlier, when you came in, I broke my toes, and that's why I'm sitting down. Because their toes are swelling. All right, so when did the Exodus take place? That's the first question when it comes to critical issues related to this book. I'm not going to talk about the plagues because we're going to lecture about the plagues, and I've got a PowerPoint for that because Bo and Matthew only learn from pictures, and so I have some pictures for them. I do too. I have an art degree too, so don't worry. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to, who doesn't learn by pictures, to be fair? I mean, come on. 1 Kings chapter 6. So 1 Kings chapter 6, and this chart comes out of John Walton's Charts of the Old Testament. It's a little helpful little book. It's like $20. And it's just a book of charts showing you all this. So this is directly out of that. All right, so in chapter 6 of 1 Kings, it says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon reign, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So Solomon began building the temple. His 4th year of reign, 480 years after the Exodus. This is the first and earliest text that you can try to assign a date to. Does everybody understand? We roughly know that David was king, either 1010 or 1000. The 2 dating systems, David is really not debated. In 2000, they found what's known as the Tel Dan inscription, which has David's name mentioned on it being king, which proves archaeology-wise that David is real and he did exist. So let that sink in. David in the academy has not been real until 2000. In confessional circles, 100%, but at LSU or University of Georgia or Yale, Harvard, you name it, David was not a real person until 2000 when they found this inscription. Now, we were able to assign the date 1010 to 1000 because we know roughly when Saul became king. Next semester, we'll talk about 1 Samuel chapter 9 and how that text should read that Saul was king for. My translation just says ... Your translation may say 20 years, 40 years. It's unclear. So we have the date of Solomon's date, since this is my PowerPoint, and I get to choose. I cut my teeth on John Bright's History of Israel. Is that the one you use, Micah, or do you use Provan, Longman, and
I read Provan Longman first.
Okay. So I'd use Bright. So there's several History of Israels, and once you kind of read it, you select your dating system. And so Bright argues that David became king in 960. Or 1000, and he reigned 40 years. So that gets you to 960. You now subtract 4 years, and that puts the temple being built at 956 BC. So I see the math. Okay. I have 10 fingers and now 8 toes. So I don't really have the full workings of 20. So the math is difficult. They're still there, kind of. It's questionable, but it was, as my wife said, shattered. Judges 11, verse 26, says that Israel occupied Canaan for 300 years before the judgeship of Jephthah. And then it says that Moses lived in Midian for 40 years during exile. So the two really main arguments for dating the Exodus to the 15th century, which is called the early date, because it's further from us, is a reference in 1 Kings 6:1, and this reference to 300 years in the book of Judges. Now, on the far right is the late date arguments in response to the left. Like the late date arguments aren't really arguments as much as they're responses to the early date positions. Do I understand? They're going to argue that the number 480 is symbolic, that 12 times 40 is 480 years. We know that the number 40 is a pretty big number, right? I mean, it happens all the time. David reigned for 40 years. Solomon reigned for 40 years. Jesus was tempted for 40 days. They wandered for 40 years. You even get like Isaac was 40 when he got married. There's all these 40s. Obviously, 12 is a symbolic number. You have the 12 disciples. You have the 12 sons of Jacob, right? So that's argued to be symbolic. Now, there's a reason they're going to argue this later. Don't worry, we'll cover that. They also argue the number 300 in the book of Judges is an exaggeration because most is this? You can correct me if I'm overstating this. I don't know of a single person that does Old Testament that thinks the book of Judges is chronological. Like it's more cyclical, meaning this account appear in chapter 3 and this account over here in 4 and 5 actually overlap. They're not like this happens, then there's a period of time, and then the next one happens, there's a period of time. They're actually overlapping. And so to make a historically reliable time stamp of that period is really difficult. And so they'll argue. Now, obviously, this becomes an issue because you have the biblical text saying 300 years. And there's no fancy math for that, right? There's no fancy 7 times whatever, and then this one, it's true. This is not a reference at all to the Exodus because he's in Midian before the Exodus. I don't know why they had that one in there. Kind of seems to me that this proves this one over here better, that 40 is functioning symbolically, but I digress. From there, they will argue outside of the Bible. So now we have the Bernetta Stele that mentions Israel, and it dates to 1220. The Amarna tablets date to 1400 BC talk about the Hebrew. The Hebrew were a bunch of bandits, apparently, or thieves. And to associate Hebrew with Hebrew erroneous. However, within the last 2 or 3 years, I've seen a re-interest in the fact that the Hebrew may actually be the Hebrews, that the Hebrew may not be just a stock term for thieves, bandits. It may be a stock word for non-Egyptians. And so that's a potential. Like that, I read an article in the last 1 or 2 years from Biblical Archaeological Review on that topic. And then the early data allows for length of time assigned to the period of Judges for 250 years, which we're going to talk about. And then the dream stele of Tutmosis IV indicates that he was not the legal heir of the throne. The legal heir possibly died during the 10th plague. That's also not a good argument when you have to use the word possibly. One of the things we're going to talk about in the book of Exodus, particularly the first 5 chapters, the only 3 names that were given are Pua, Shiphrah, and Moses. Moses' mom and dad are not named until chapter 6, and Miriam is not named until chapter 20, somewhere in there, a little later than that. It chooses not to tell us the Pharaoh, which is important, okay? Because I think the reason for it is because assigning the Pharaoh assigns it to a period of time, and it then forces the book not to be read in different contexts in Israel's history, where that Pharaoh can represent someone different as you read through it. And then archaeological data, they argue that Jericho and Hatzor support a 15th century date, and I will tell you, archaeological data and archaeologists' dating system is kind of like king cake season in New Orleans. They all bake king cakes, but they all do them differently. And so it's not really a consistent, they're all going to place those 2 destruction layers to the 15th century. And then they will argue that the Exodus took place during Tutmosis IV and his reign. Now, one of the issues here is only 2 pharaohs in all of ancient Egypt's history reigned for a period of years that overlap with long enough reigns to fit into this sequence, and they're both Tutmosis IV and Ramesses II. Now, on the right, they'll tell you the Merneptah stele indicates Israel in the land of Palestine by this date by the name Israel, but it does not occur in documents until 1220. And that the Hebrew, they say dismiss that because they were probably not the Israelites. The 40-year traditional 40 years for a generation was excessive since the judges needed to span about 150 years. You're going to see this in a minute. They will tell you the dream stele is a terrible argument. And then the other arguments is Lachish, Jericho, Hatzor, which are the main 3, support a later date of 13th century. Bethel and Debir have minimal destruction compared to Lachish, Hatzor, and Jericho. So we're still debating over data, and so what do we do with this? In addition to that, what do we do with the fact that in the biblical text of Exodus, so if you go back to Exodus chapter 1, so we go to there. What we find is it says in verse 11, now they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens, and they built for the Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. Now there are 2 Ramesses. There's more than 2, but there's Ramesses II, which is the 13th century date Ramesses, and Ramesses I. But one of them is known specifically for his building and his widespread capitalization of things like building infrastructure, and that is Ramesses II. He was also quite well known for having over 90 wives. And so that's worth mentioning as well. Let's turn to the book of Acts, chapter 13. Beginning in verse 17. Men of Israel and you that fear God, listen. The God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm, he led them out of it. For about 40 years, he bore with them in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, by the way, that 40 years is the book of Numbers. And then destroyed 7 nations. That's a reference to Deuteronomy 7, but also what they do in Joshua. Deuteronomy 7 mentions the 7 nations. He gave them their land as an inheritance for about 450 years. And after that, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. What's that 450 years? That's from the Exodus. So Paul says 450. Septuagint says 430. And 1 Kings 6:1 says 480. So which is it? You got to remember, we're having conversations only conservatives have. We're discussing the historical event.
You said the Septuagint says 430 years. What do you mean? Where's that?
Septuagint's rendering of Exodus is 430. Here's 450. So James Hoffmeyer, in his article in Jets, says the 3 different dates, 1 Kings 6:1, Septuagint, and Acts 13, you can't nail it down for one or the other. Keith.
Is there any way to know, like, where Paul is pulling this from?
No, he certainly seems like he's doing what's known as like an echo or an illusion. These biblical texts, right? It's like you say something, but he's expecting us, the listeners, to know exactly where he's pulling from. The fact that I can do that means most of this. It should be able to do that. Yeah, I don't know. Now, the next slide comes from Joseph Blenkinsop, so understand that it looks great on the screen, but I don't know that it's going to be great. So he dates 966, so let's just leave it there. So he takes a Solomon became king at 970, not 960, so you subtract forward. All right, so from the Exodus to the building of Solomon's temple was 480 years. So that gives us a date somewhere around 1446 to 1440. He then says roughly 430 years following the impasse of the period from the construction of the temple equals the Edict of Cyrus, which is a famous text. That's Cyrus's edict in 536. And then you add 50 years to that, which gets you the grand total of 480. For the exile brings the number to 480 years between the Exodus, the first temple, and the ending at that point when, according to Ezra 1, the start was made for the second temple. So by tracking along with his math. And then if you take the 3 major points of Israel's history, so if I subtract 50 from 536, that gives me 486. And if I subtract 480 again, and what do I get? The estimated birth of Christ. Your textbooks teach Jesus was born 4 to 6 BC. So he's arguing that the first temple, second temple, and its destruction and the rebuilding under Cyrus's edict that takes place around Zerubbabel, with Haggai and Zechariah. You subtract those dates, and then you subtract 480. So he's saying the 3 major events: the first temple, or the Exodus, first temple, rebuilding of the second temple, and the birth of Christ are all 480. And that's how he argues that these are not historical numbers. Now, he is incorrect, to be clear. He is incorrect. Why is he incorrect? There's a couple reasons why he's incorrect personally, but what's the first reason he's incorrect? It deals with the numbers themselves. He's assigning the dates that he wants to the certain events. The rebuilding of the temple is actually in 520 to 516, not 486. Everybody understand? So he is redefining when Zerubbabel, the rebuilding of the second temple happens, which is Zechariah. And Ezra's recording it. And so he's moving that number to accommodate his argument. The Exodus, 480, 480, 480. Everybody understand? What's another argument? So that's the chief one. Like he's moving the dates around to make it fit. Any other critiques?
I see saying Solomon became king in 966.
That's the fourth year of the reign.
Okay.
Yeah, so he dates him at 970, which he's taking guy's name, Thiel, Thiele, is more likely he's taking Thiel's dating compared to John Bright's dating. So we'll move on. This is the bigger problem. If we go from 1 Kings 6:1 and work backwards, everybody track? Like literally work backwards, adding the years. I understand what I'm doing. This is not me. This is Philip Long's, The Art of Biblical History. He also evangelical. He says if we go backwards and we add them all up, we get 633 years, not 480. And for what it's worth, it's these slides here, these judges.
Because what you were saying.
If you overlap them, you don't have a problem. So just taking the biblical text and working backwards disproves the second major argument of the early daters, that the 300 years before Jephthah. Does that make sense? But if you want to then overlap them, you can still just remove that as your argument. That one's just superfluous. All right. So what's at risk taking a 13th century date compared to a 15th century date? Everybody understand what I'm asking? Let me phrase it differently. I won't put Mike on the spot. I'm a 13th century dater. I know of one 15th century dater on faculty. I know several that are 13th century. So what is your critique of me in that position?
I want to see more of the basing. I know it's rooted in the Hebrew language with the generations or with the timing in First Kings 6, and that wording could also be used generations as years or thousands, whatever that wording difference is. But I'm curious to see where it was.
I'm sorry.
I've heard the argument of
So you're going to read that article in the Book of Numbers,
okay,
by Humphreys, where he argues that the word for thousand in Genesis is translated as true. So when it says, for example, in Numbers 1, that the number of Reubenites is 400 or 46,500. So you would remove the 1,000 and you would say that there are 46 troop groups equaling 500. Do you understand? So you're going to read that whole article. You're going to read another one by Wenham. We're going to have this discussion. Are there 2.5, 2.4 million ancient Israelites? Or is there roughly 30,000? Be there later.
I'm still hearing how you said we were going to go into a reason of why the 13th century dating makes sense in the 40 times 12 range. I'm just curious.
I think for me, I think a lot of those numbers are intentionally symbolic. Personally, I think the use of 40 is intentionally symbolic. Doesn't mean they're not literally true, but I think they're symbolic. They keep repeating themselves over and over and over again. The same way everyone kept finding spouses at wells. Are they finding their spouses at wells, or is that God's sovereignty and picking those wives. Kind of. That's a Albert author argument from the art of biblical narrative. Yeah, I think what makes some of us uncomfortable is what do you do with a text that you read and it says it literally, and that's what you should believe it as. But let's rewind the tape for all of you in Old Testament survey. When I asked you if God has a body, how many of you said he didn't have a body? I can still remember the day when almost everybody says God doesn't have a body. And my response back to you is, well, what do you do with chapter 2 when he's walking in the garden with him and talking to him like a human? Like that literally says he was walking in the coolness of the day, called out to Adam and Eve. So why do you, handful that raised your hand, don't believe God had a body, dismiss the text that literally says he's walking in the coolness of the day in the Garden of Eden that talks to Adam and Eve? You see, this is the same argument. You get to say, no, that's just describing how that happened. And then I say the numbers are symbolic. So there has to kind of be some hermeneutical consistency. For the record, I don't think I have a body there. So you follow what I'm saying? Like, at what point, right? So the question that needs to be asked, are all numbers symbolic? That's the question that needs to be asked. All numbers symbolic? And the answer is no, they're not all symbolic. Would you agree that, Mike? I'm putting you on the spot.
They're all.
Are numbers always symbolic? Are they some of them symbolic? If some of them are, when do we determine which ones are symbolic? Sorry, that's what happens when you fill in for Taylor.
It's a good question. I would say you'd be more likely to be able to tell if they're symbolic or not if they get repeated over and over and you're starting to pick up patterns. I would think authors play on patterns quite a lot. Yeah, that would give you a hint to like, oh, maybe there's something.
Yeah, I think that if I can be as bold in saying this, when you take interpreting the Bible, the first step is literary context. That is literally your introduction to literary context. There is so much more to the literariness of the biblical text. So much more than we ever introduce, even at a master's level, that there's a lot going on literarily speaking that is communicating more than we often pick up on. Fair? Yeah. So I think that's part of it. These numbers of 12, 40, and 7. Like Joshua 7. Joshua 6 uses the number 7, I think, 19 times. All right, so there's just repetitive 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. I think it happened, yeah. All that to say is I can't do an Alexis class. I didn't do this in their seminar because I don't think it's of any value. The fact that you believe in an Alexis is sufficient for me. But to reconstruct the history of Israel, you have to kind of be exposed to these issues. Yeah, but y'all read about it, and I didn't want to bore you to tears with everything, but I have bored you to tears some of it. All right, we're going to come back to the plagues later because I've got a lot about the plagues. And no. All right, so let's shift gears. Micah's in the room, so if y'all have follow-up questions on Micah's lecture, he can actually answer them. Or if you want further discussion about it, we can as well. But if not, we are going to turn our attention to the reading for today. Questions on Jacob, preferably not while he's wrestling God. Hey, guys, I can handle that quite well. Honestly, someone asked me about it. I said, in 20 years, I've never taught that. Anything about Joseph you want to add? Poor Micah, I gave him chapters 22, 25 through the end of the book, so it's not really fair for him to have to cover all that when I only have 21 chapters. But I do think it's the book of Joshua, the Joshua narrative is quite fascinating in that, as I pointed out, the clothing plays a prominent role. You've got the colorful jacket that gets used to deceive their father. You get Potiphar's wife stealing his outcloak to have him imprisoned, and then he dresses like an Egyptian to deceive his brothers. So the narrative is kind of controlled by 3 articles of clothing. Also speaks to the larger theological teaching of God as sovereign, and he brings about Joseph's demise to bring about Israel's deliverance or giving them. I will get into the book of Exodus. All right. Well, if not, let's turn to the faint of heart, to the religion of the patriarchs. And what a doozy. Okay. So I'm not really sure how best to attack this, other than saying the reason I had you read Pentateuchal stuff first week about documentary hypothesis is because everybody deals with it. You have to be familiar with it. Don't have to agree to it. I certainly don't. If you look at that article beginning on the second full page, he begins with the first full paragraph outlining what he is going to attempt to answer. He says at least 4 factors can be pointed or pinpointed which contribute to the uncertainty of who was the Israelite patriarch's God or gods. First, Genesis itself says relatively little about patriarchal religion. It tells us much more about their religious experiences, but little about their beliefs and religious practices, which is a true statement. Secondly, the accounts of the patriarchs as we now have them are all post-Sinaitic, meaning after the book of Exodus 19 through 40, the book of Leviticus, and book of Numbers chapter 10, 1 through 10, 11. They presuppose the innovations in belief and practice that date from the time of Moses. He goes on, he says, various texts allude to the differences between the religion of Moses and that of the patriarchs. For example, he starts off with that text. It's so difficult. He starts with Exodus 6, verse 3. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. Joshua 24:14 states, put away the gods of your fathers beyond the river and in Egypt and serve Yahweh. Both of these texts appear to contrast the religious ideas and practices of the fathers with the post-Mosaic period. Yet Genesis itself gives very few hints that the patriarchs worshiped their other gods. Indeed, it usually describes the God who appears and speaks to the patriarchs as Yahweh, that is, the God of Moses. This prompts the third question. Is this identification of the patriarch's God with that of Moses a theological assertion by the writer of Genesis, who was sure the same God had spoken to Abraham as spoke to Moses? Or do the statements in Genesis imply that Yahweh revealed himself to the patriarchs correspond to the patriarchs' own conception of the God they worshipped? It then goes on and says, lastly, Jews and Christians who regard Abraham as the father of the faithful are reluctant to accept that he was a polytheist who served strange gods. On the other hand, scholars who hold that religion is essentially a human creation are hardly likely to suppose that the patriarchs were purely monotheists. All right, so I think the first thing we have to do is define terms. We have to define what we think about the early Israelites. Were they polytheistic, worshiping more than one God? Were they henotheistic? Were they sort of mixed and matched deities at whims? So for a season, they'll worship Asherah, or for a season, Baal, or a season, Yahweh. So I track. Or were they monotheists? And when was monotheism created? That's a big discussion. Most scholars argue that monotheism was created in the 8th century under Hosea's writing under the influence of Deuteronomy that many scholars are now placing around Hosea's 8th century date. Or were they monotheistic monolatrious? It's my favorite term. I think that was, wasn't that Somner's argument? They were monotheistic monolatrious or monolatry. Monolatry is you believe in a God, but you do not deny other gods exist. So we read Ben Somner's work for seminar, and he's an Orthodox Jewish man, and he argues that ancient Israel was monotheistic, but also monolatrious. So he's pushing back against the majority of scholarship that argues that ancient Israel was polytheistic. In fact, he would say some of them describe them as polytheistic monotheists. They believed in a God, but they believed in other gods at times as well. We see this when we start finding that God has a wife. Her name is Asherah, where we find archaeological findings where it says Yahweh and his Asherah. What do we do when we find Yahweh of Shechem in these inscriptions? So it seems to be localizing Yahweh to a city, which may be different from, say, Yahweh of Jerusalem. So you have a question?
I feel like we kind of discussed that in Old Testament survey.
We briefly touch on it, yes.
And that kind of, there's two perspectives that pop in my mind, which is one is the idea of being polytheistic, but then shifting to monotheism, and that transition can be kind of awkward, where they're like, okay, yeah, I guess those gods aren't the ones we'll focus on, but I guess they're still kind of real. Then there's also ideas, and I can't remember where around this past week, that those gods were evil manifested, basically. Demons, depending on who's talking about it, what title they get. So they're lower level, but still described as gods, not on the same level as Yahweh would be.
Okay.
And so it kind of sounds like an overlap of ideas by putting that polytheistic and monotheistic together.
Okay. There's also the argument of the people we know by name in the Bible were monotheists, but the people around them were monotheists, polytheists, monolatrious. I'm not so sure we can determine that, but I do think that Joshua text that we just looked at suggests that they still kept gods from the river, Euphrates, and the gods of Egypt. So they clearly were worshiping pagan gods, and that's why Joshua says, "As for me and my house, I will serve the Lord." It's kind of a key text. I'm uploading something for us. I'm trying to multitask here. All right, let's go back to the article, and then we'll fill out some more questions, and we'll jump in the weeds. All right, so he asked the question, did the patriarchs worship a god called Yahweh? Are the divine promises made to the patriarchs an early element in the tradition, or were they added by later editors? Did patriarchal religion differ from later Israelite religion, or are the accounts in Genesis simply retrojections of later first millennium beliefs, practices into distant past? All right, so what do you think? Why are we so quiet? This is a fun thing to discuss, by the way.
What question are you asking?
To what extent do you think when it says Abraham worshiped Yahweh, but what do you do with Exodus 6:3? It says that they never did. That's for everybody.
Would it have something to do with Yahweh in its God's promises to Moses having similar and even the same covenantal echoes as he did for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob?
Repeat that one more time.
So would it be having the same covenantal promises as to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the same things reiterated in the Mosaic covenant, and those connections in covenant points to the same God?
That's potential. I think that's what Wenham tries to bring out a little bit. I don't think he holds that, but he certainly is wanting to bring that out. So this may give us some clarity, because it's that way I'm not reading you the article. So this was my Defend the Faith presentation in January. So essentially, what they argues, critical scholars argue, is that the divine self-revelations in Exodus 3, the burning bush, I am who I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, is not in good standing with Exodus 6:3. That Exodus 6:3 functions as a contradiction. That's where we get this text where we're dealing with it. I let myself be known as El Shaddai to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Yahweh to someone else. And so I would argue through canonical criticism, we can come to a sort of reading of the text together, which that's not today's journey or purpose. I don't need to read this text because most of you know it. We're going to exegete it next Tuesday. This divine revelation, self-revelation of God at the burning bush, where he argues that I am Elohim of your father, and Elohim of Abraham, Elohim of Isaac, Elohim of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Elohim. We'll come back to that. And then obviously that's the second portion. We've already looked at this text. I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. So when we look at this quote from Graham Davies' newest commentary, he says, essentially, the way you understand Exodus 3 and 6 is that they are sources, that part of the documentary hypothesis. The name Yahweh is therefore explained in a number of different ways in the book of Exodus in passages that derive from several different literary sources and redactionary layers. He then, for our sake, layer is terrible. We start looking. So here are just some examples. This is just a sampling. This is not the chart that Wenham uses, but it does help us. That Elohim is the creator in Genesis 1, not Yahweh. Yahweh Elohim occurs in 2:4. Yahweh first occurs in Genesis 4:1 as a standalone name. We then have El Shaddai, God Almighty, and that's where he talks about they take place in the narrative and in the, at times, the conversation, the dialogues. So obviously Genesis 17 is that section dealing with the Abrahamic covenant of circumcision. So we have all these different references to El Shaddai. Shaddai by itself just means Almighty. It occurs 41 times in the Old Testament, but only Genesis 49 and Numbers 24. And there's in verse 16 under Pentateuch. All the others are found in the book of Job. From there, he goes with El Elyon, and that is primarily Genesis 14, which that makes a big point for Cross when we look at his argument, as does El Olam, God everlasting, and El Roy, the God who sees. So what we know is that these epitaphs, is what Cross will call them. He then goes on, and so we have these also add to the conundrum, because it says in the Hebrew text, Yahweh said to Abraham. Well, that stands in stark contrast to 6:3. You have Abraham believed Yahweh. That is the famous covenantal text that Paul cites from, right? That he believed Yahweh and he credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Ur of Chaldeans. Genesis 25:21, Isaac prayed to Yahweh on behalf of his wife because she was childless. Yahweh answered his prayer. And then Genesis 26:2, Yahweh appeared to Isaac. Genesis 28:13, there above it stood Yahweh. And he said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. It's been a while since I've said it for this class. I'm just reading you the biblical text. All right. Yes, Alex.
So the academy, are they saying that that's two different, like,
Yahweh and El Shaddad as two different people in that, when that's, or what's the argument they're making there?
It's a great question. So let's pull up the article. We're going to work through these. Does everybody have it? Should helpful. All right. We're not going to worry about the raw data. That's not my concern on the raw data. That's pages 3 and following, where he talks about the very helpful chart showing framework, dialogue, framework for the different cycles, how the names are being used. He then works you through the various forces alleged, right? So he's putting them based on his source divisions. That's worth noting, as I told Benjamin on Monday, that the documentary hypothesis for every person that believes it has their own variation of it. So it's not really a consistent documentary hypothesis approach. But I want us to look on page, so we're going to work through the first ones. We're going to start with page 8 in Albrecht Alt's argument, the God of the Fathers. And then we're going to look at crosses, and then we're going to look at third. And then we're going to talk about why this is so dangerous and why it's so important. All right, so Albrecht Alt taught my boy Gerhard von Rad. You know, he also is the famous person who, when we talk about law, made the famous argument of distinctions between casuistic law and apodictic law. So those of you who remember your law lecture, that's just Albrecht Alt. So on one area, he's correct, and on another, maybe a little off. He says on page 9, first full paragraph, Alt begins his essay by surveying the problem of recovering the content of patriarchal religion. The compiler of Genesis identified Yahweh with God of Abraham, God of Isaac, the God of and with the God of Abraham, and so on. And it's a typo. From here, for him, these were the different names of the same God. But according to Alt, the historical development of the religion was more complex, and often the compiler of Genesis had to read his own ideas into the traditional material, thus distorting the picture of the patriarchal age. In reality, the earliest phase of the religion of the patriarchs worshiped the gods of their fathers. We see that. I'm the God of your fathers. The oldest names of patriarchal deities are actually found in the narratives where you have the fear of Isaac, the mighty one of Jacob, alternatively described as the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. The third deity is also mentioned, the God of Abraham. According to Alt, these were 3 different gods worshipped by different tribal groups in the nomadic period, that is the patriarchal age, prior to the settlement in the land of Canaan, prior to the book of Joshua. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob each worshipped a different deity. And the author merged their God to be one deity. Now, according to Alt's, different tribal groups arrived in Canaan at different times, bringing with them different deities. The largest group, the Jacob tribes, that's the people of Israel, worshiped the God of Jacob and settled in the east and north of the country. Another group, the Isaac tribe, settled around Beersheba and worshiped the God of Isaac, while Abraham group settled around Mamre and worshiped the God of Abraham. And in course of time, the El gods of the local Canaanite shrines were identified with the gods of the fathers, thus giving these tribal gods their own name instead of an anonymous God of Jacob, like the El, the God of Israel. Okay, so that's essentially Alt's argument. He evaluates it. Not many people hold that anymore. Basically, he critiques and says that Alt's argument sustains the belief that ancient Israel was polytheistic. Straightforward. It's pretty easy to come to that conclusion. More problematic, however, is Frank Moore-Cross, and that would be on page 11. Frank Moore-Cross was the Hebrew Bible chair at Harvard until his death. He has trained some of the most famous human beings that are still alive to this day. And this theory is still alive and well. It's just kind of like the documentary hypothesis where it's just being molded and adapted. This is still the standard in the field for the most part. You'll notice it says the paragraph begins, Cross begins by summarizing Alt's essay. Though he agrees with Alt's general picture of patriarchal religion as a personal clan religion based on revelation of patriarchs, he disagrees with Alt in seeing the patriarch's God as originally anonymous. He goes on and argues that the high god of Canaan was El. And he substantiates that argument based on the previous slide here. He says in other words, passages that call God of the patriarchs El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Olam, etc., are not secondary later elements that were added to the tradition after the settlement of Canaan, but rather they function as the God of El with epitaphs assigned to it. So everybody understand? He then goes on and he argues, for example, on the last paragraph of page 11, the last three sentences, there are in the Hebrew text El Eleh Israel in Genesis 33:20, which must be translated El, the God of Israel. He also then argues in Genesis 46:3, El Abika functions as El, the God of your father, and El Olam, the eternal God. All right, so when does God become Yahweh then? What does he argue? Remember? Also, he puts a lot of stock in Genesis 14, El Elyon, God, Most High, creator of heaven and earth. That's not how you got taught that text in this class, nor in Noti survey. All right, so what do we do with this? He then argues, and it's been rejected, the whole section on Shaddai, El Shaddai, the God of the mountain. There's no etymological evidence that Shaddai and Shaddai are the same, but he argues because El was the God of the mountain of the underworld, and he is creating the Genesis is showing that Israel worship, or the patriarch worshiped the deity. So where does he become Yahweh? Does anyone know? Now, he's going to argue, much like Note does, say Israel, the Promised Land next semester. Martin Note similarly makes this argument that ancient Israel served these various deities, but in the book of Judges, because remember, they argue that the Exodus didn't happen. And guess who the ancient ancestors of the Israelites really are? You might want to guess within the academy who they are. And I would even say, I know some evangelicals make this argument, by the way. None that work here. I know some that make this argument. They're Canaanites. The ancient Israelites are Canaanites. And so to establish their own identity, they created the name Yahweh as a replacement for El worship of the patriarchs. And Note argues that took place in the book of Judges. And then they have the ark as the centerpiece of their religion. Now, none of us believe this. No one on this equity, I don't believe that, because that would not really align with what the biblical text teaches. However, if you want to go look on the Jerusalem Post 2 years ago, they've said they found DNA from an ancient Israelite body, and the DNA came back, what do you think? Canaanite. Even the Jerusalem Post reports that their identity is now DNA tested to be Canaanite. It's wild. It's wild. All right, so how do we as confessional Christians address this issue? You're all so quiet. And I know you have thoughts.
I don't have a solution.
Because my first thought was that Elohim and all the variations of El are these descriptors that the patriarchs are giving onto Yahweh. So they're still worshiping him, but they might be ignorant of it. But that doesn't work out when the text says, and God said to Abraham, I am Yahweh.
And it also doesn't help when God changes Jacob's name to
Israel.
right, El.
Yeah.
Couldn't help with it. Yahweh.
It's not the, it all goes back to, I guess, how you would view the authorship of the text.
Now we're getting somewhere. Now we're having some conversation. Not that you want, but it comes back to authorship issues. So for critical scholars, they identify these different sources maintaining different epitaphs. And then they'll argue that Yahweh is a priestly name. But then if you noticed, Wenham actually used their own, like, you're like, well, he's a documentary hypothesis person. If you read him close enough, what he's like, the P does mainly Yahweh, but the basic premise of the P source is that J and E exist, and he is aware of the J and E, and he would have corrected J and E. So he can't really be thoroughly documentary hypothesis because he's saying the very essence, the last one that's responsible for bringing the 5 books into their final form would not have let this stand in tension the way it stands. Everybody track along? So he's not really a classic documentary guy. All right. So let's think about what you said, Matt. Let's extrapolate this. I think we all can agree that Moses is the primary author. Some of you will say sole author. I'm going to go with primary. You'll understand. I'll get to Deuteronomy at the end of the year. Okay. Primary. He wrote the majority. Okay. If he wrote the majority, then that would accommodate why Yahweh is found in all the text in Genesis. It doesn't alleviate the 6:2, but it also, if you're reading the Hebrew text like Micah and I are, the only problem at that point is actually 6:2 in Exodus, not the book of Genesis. Does everybody understand? So they're putting the emphasis is on 6:2 is creating the problem in the book of Genesis. But by Moses being the primary author of Genesis, he's using Yahweh throughout the text, but also sprinkling in the text Elohim, El Shaddai, Elyon, El Olam, El Roy, which I think is a holdover of how God revealed himself to the ancient Israelites before Moses records the information. Does everybody understand? And one of you, I think you said, are these more descriptive of God? So remember, El doesn't have to be chief deity El. It can just be the God that I'm worshiping. And I know him as Almighty God. I know him as the God that sees. He is also the God Almighty. And those are most high. So they're no longer El epitaphs. They are generic, the God I worship. And I know, by the way, that's almost how all of you were taught the names of God in the Old Testament. This is the God who sees and understands. This is the God who is almighty. This is the God who is most high. But what the scholars are saying, no, these are epitaphs of the chief Mesopotamian God El. So Moses retains those because they kind of fall out of favor in Exodus and following. Notice most of this discussion is only focusing on where? Genesis. Because outside of there, you move into Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh Elohim. So I understand? I think that's the way you kind of handle this. Canonically and from a robust authorship perspective. So it's a very good observation, Benji.
So would Moses then be putting words in the mouth of God? Because
In what way? What do you mean by that?
like in Genesis 28 and Genesis 15, where he says to Abraham, he says to Jacob, I am Yahweh.
Yeah, so in those texts, right? I think when he says this one, and Abraham believed Yahweh, or Isaac prayed to Yahweh, or Yahweh appeared here, or in Exodus just 28, I am Yahweh. I think that I wouldn't go as, I'm just phrasing it, let's sound more reverent of the inspirational process, that God inspired Moses to write, I am Yahweh, so that you, the reader, can connect that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is now the one revealing himself to Moses in 6:2. So we're alleviating the tensions of Genesis, but we're not getting around 6:2 of Exodus. And that's fine. Remember, first week, I said the Jewish rabbis used to say, quit trying to solve all the rough patches. Let those rough patches exist and rub them together and just move on. You have a question on your face.
So Genesis 28:13 is a dream, correct? It says it.
Sure.
We look at Isaiah in Isaiah 6. We don't think Isaiah is a vision of the Lord. Moses saw God's back. It does not just be. We don't think Isaiah literally saw God.
You don't?
Well, I mean, like in the sense that, like, okay, it's a vision. So, like, I'm looking at you with my actual eyes. I'm not having a vision of you. Okay. It does not just be kind of the same line there. And I may have just committed some heresy, but
I'm not following.
Are you saying there's a difference between a vision and a dream and what's taking place here?
no, I'm equating the dream and the vision and the difference between what Moses saw at the burning bush. Or like, and that I mean, I feel like in my mind that smooths out the difference in the names. But I could be wrong.
I'm trying to get y'all to smooth it out.
What about 15? That's not a vision.
I don't know. I'm trying to think here. I'm the only one saying anything. So
Inspired the rest of the class.
I said what I said. He said, whoa, let's be more reverent to inspiration.
No, I'm just trying to make sure.
We're saying that Moses, with all the benefits of inspired authorship and the Holy Spirit, is looking back at Genesis, recounting the story, and where God said, Elohim, he's pretty much going back and saying, well, Yahweh, I don't like that. So
it's also Moses writing all this,
That would be the approach I would
Jeff.
encourage you.
according to Jeff.
I would encourage you to have that position.
So, I mean, I see there's tension there, but isn't that tension okay? Because it's one author?
It's okay.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
All right, so why is with 7 minutes, we can't get to Westermont, but Westermont's going to take a traditional tradition history approach, which is also, he was, I believe, was he note student? Do you recall? I think Westermont was he note student or was he von Rad student? No, he was Gunkel student. He took Gunkel and then ran with it, so he was Gunkel student. So, you know, you kind of, a lot of these guys, you have to know their, we know coaching trees, like this head coach taught all these, these coaches. You really have to follow thought trees. So you have Gunkel, who's famous for the forms of Psalms, and now you have Gunkel redefines those Psalms and simplifies them for us. And then he also then moves in this direction. And so you kind of have to follow those trees. But essentially, Westermont is doing this traditional historical approach, which is also what von Rad does. And so he's arguing for traditions being embedded in the text. Like there are these traditions of these deities embedded in the text and trying to reconcile them. So let's do this. Why this is important, and this is why it's important, because some of your family, people at church, will go and buy The Unseen Realm by Michael Heisman. And he starts with like Psalm 82 and some other Psalms about the divine counsel. The problem with his approach is that it's just a Christianized spin-off of this, and it is very interesting. However, I've just showed you where all the academy is on the other side of that same coin. Does that make sense? So let's say you read the Unseen Realm and you're like, man, this is awesome. I want to go read the next book on this. And you decide, well, you know what? I'm going to go read Mark Smith's work, Early Israelite Religion, or Early Israelite Yahwism. Do not do that. Because Yahweh is El and partly Baal, and it comes from Ugarit. And he is an ordained Catholic who teaches at a very prestigious institution. Or you buy Zoni Zavit, because that sounds like a Jewish name, because it is, and he wrote the famous work of 2001, and it's called Israelite Religion. And guess what he's going to conclude? The same thing we just all went through trying to push back on. So what Heiser did was helpful, but what ends up happening is they argue that there is El at the top of the pantheon, and there are all these other deities, and that Yahweh by the Israelites replaced El and put him at the top of the pantheon, and that other deities exist, but two of them you cannot worship, Baal and Asherah. Why? Because that is El's son and El's son's wife. So those are off the table. The other deities sit on that divine council. And that's the flip side of Michael Heiser's argument, that he interests us, but then you go read widely and you're like, your head begins to spin. I think it's okay to live in the gray. It's okay to live in the gray with this, but I think authorship issues solved a lot of it. That was the canonical argument I gave that I didn't give you all. So what we're going to do Tuesday of next week, we are going to do chapters 1 through 6. I don't have to spend time on chapter 6. We did that today, but we will look at the midwives. We will look at chapter 3 in depth, and we'll talk about my favorite topic, God hardening Pharaoh's heart before sending him back. So we'll have some conversations theologically. Yeah. Sounds good. See you on Serve Day. Word of the day is Yahweh.
One of the slides you can paint. I also said part. That's fine.
I do. It is by, that is by Microsoft Copilot.
That's okay. That is
That's exactly where that came from. I told Copilot to make it. Pretty dope.
There you go. I would like to point out, this 15 is vision.
I should have said, make him more muscular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.